so that it'll be there within a couple of days. So for today's session, I'm really, really delighted. This is something that we've been trying to set up for a little while. So I'm really pleased that we can make it happen today. The title of the session is Architectures of the South, and followed by a sort of a verb list, which is bruising, scarring, healing, and repairing. And this is a project that's a new project, which is being led by my two guests today, Catalina Mejía Moreno and Huda Tayob. And Catalina and Huda, I think the paths intersected at the Bartlett. Am I right? Catalina coming from Colombia, where she studied in the Universidad de los Andes and practiced as an architect before arriving to the UK to do a master's in the Bartlett and then to do a PhD in Newcastle. And she's currently lecturer in Sheffield, in the School of Architecture in Sheffield, and head of humanities in the Sheffield School of Architecture. And a lot of Catalina's work has been actually to do with feminist pedagogies. With Emma Cheetle, she led a very interesting conference in 2019 called Fielding Architecture, Feminist Practices of a Decolonized Pedagogy. And more recently then has also been producing work which is, I think, more relating to the themes we're going to be talking about today. But of course, she also has an interest in photography and questions of photographic practice and sight and so on. So I don't know if that'll come in today, but anyway, I know that that's an ongoing interest for Catalina as well. And Huda is studied in the University of Cape Town before coming to the Bartlett to do her PhD, and she's currently now back there as a lecturer, having been the course convener for History and Theory and the leader of a unit in the Graduate School of Architecture in the University of Johannesburg. And her research has focused on migrant and minor and subaltern architectures, and actually, like Catalina, she has a strong interest in pedagogy and in curriculum, as part of an open access curriculum project called Race, Space and Architecture. We might put the link to that up in the chat once we get going. So the idea for today is that Catalina and Huda, and I'm not sure who's going first. One or other was going to, Huda's going to go first. So, and they're both going to talk to us a little bit about the origins of this project and their hopes for it. And then the idea is that we'll get a conversation going. Let's see how we go. In terms of conversation, I mean, I'm hoping that people can just unmute and ask questions or make points or make comments if you want to go into the chat and just to propose to ask if you want to say something or just to make a comment, please do so. Okay, Huda, over to you and welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Hugh, and for the invitation to be here today. And we're looking forward to the conversation. And this is a very new project that we've been working on it for a while, but it's still in its kind of early stages. So we're looking forward to comments and questions and as we develop it further. So what we thought, because we wanted to speak about specifics as well as the more general idea behind the project, we thought we'd split we'd start by each presenting a short excerpt of individual projects. So I'll present just about 10 minutes first, and then Catalina, and then we'll open up with a set of questions that really frames this new collective project that we're forming. So, okay, so I'm going to start. So this project is part of a larger piece and essay that I've written for eFlux and should come out soon. It looks at the relationship between fiction and architecture. And part of the kind of questions that guide it is to ask what it means to speak about the unspeakable. And I'm aware of the contradiction in saying this. So Yvette Christianse, a novelist and literary theorist, asks this question: what would constitute an adequate resistance to the betrayal lurking inside language? And she refers to Toni Morrison to suggest an answer, that knowledge that it is not knowledge, but rather fiction, where fiction is something other than the unreal and something always compromised, but also always oriented towards the permanently unrealizable dream. Okay. So, gender-based violence in South Africa is often referred to as a silent pandemic, yet one that is widely known. In the first 5 days of the national lockdown in April 2020, 2,230 gender-based violence cases were reported, 30% more than previous years. Newspaper headlines on June 16, 2020, Youth Day in South Africa, read, "Murders of South African women surge as 9-week lockdown eases." Pumla Dineo-Kola and Habiba Badroun, among others, argue that we need to understand this contemporary violence within longer histories of the violent coupling of gender and citizenship in South Africa. They ask us to think of, or Kola in particular, ask us to think of sexual violence and gender-based violence in South Africa, not as a moment of crisis, which is how it's often dealt with, but rather as a language. In this move, she points to an understanding of this violence as systemic and structural and related to long histories of subjugation, from apartheid to colonialism to slavery. Slavery in the Cape Colony was officially the central form of social, cultural, and economic life from 1658 to 1834. People were captured and enslaved from Mozambique, Madagascar, Malabar, India, and Southeast Asia primarily, as well as from indigenous Khoi and San communities in the Cape, and transported to the Cape to work on settler plantations. In contrast to the Atlantic Middle Passages, slavery in the Cape was largely portrayed as mild up until the late 1980s and early 1990s even. And the supposed mild nature was emphasized in a range of popular texts, cookbooks, paintings, which often depict idyllic scenes of pastoral farm living on what are effectively plantations. And it's worth noting that even the term plantation is not really used in South Africa, or it's only recently come back into conversations. In contrast, Habiba Badroun draws on John Mason's research into the Office of Protector of Slaves to argue that slavery in the Cape enforced a system that exposed women involved in domestic labor to serial violence and systematic sexual abuse. The representation of slavery as mild has become a means to evade the deep histories and hauntings of this violence that were enacted, and of the inheritances of slavery in society and space, and in gendered relationships, which is how, framing it. These deep submerged histories and hauntings are however evident in traces, slippages, and holes in narratives in architectural archives, documenting many slave-owning houses in the Cape. As Gayatri Spivak has argued, if in the context of colonial production, the subaltern has no history and cannot speak, has no voice, the subaltern as female is even more deeply in shadow. In the context of slave histories, well, Spivak is speaking of a different context, but she draws attention to the impossibility of a full representation or record, particularly in relation to the female as subaltern, who is not in a subject position from which to speak in the first place. Yet rather than seeing the inability to know fully as disabling, she suggests recognizing how fiction operates as history, and this is not in the text. This is in a text on the Rani of Simur. She suggests recognizing how fiction operates as history in the service of power, pointing to how epistemic violence operates through academic borders. And here I argue in this essay that architectural histories of the early Cape can be read both against and along the brain and fictional narrative to allow for stories of survival and surviving in precarious times and spaces, around, above, and beyond the inherited material histories of these sites, in a context where the material and linguistic hauntings is ever present. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about how I bring this into thinking about architectural history. The term Cape Dutch architecture, which some of you might know, most commonly refers to the whitewashed and stuccoed homesteads built in the Cape Colony between 1650 and 1810, the period when the Dutch were the main rulers at the Cape. These houses, usually characterized by a thatched roof, an entrance stoep, a veranda, and a dominant central gable, were generally situated in slave-owning plantations. Groot Constantia, a large plantation and homestead close to Cape Town, was declared South Africa's first national monument in 1936 and marks the beginning of architectural history in South Africa. The foundations of this origin moment, however, are laid in the preceding years, with the publishing of what are generally considered the first architectural histories of Southern Africa, which chronicle, name, and construct Cape Dutch architecture as significant. And two of the most significant texts are Alice Trotter's Old Cape Colony and Historic Houses of South Africa by Dorothea Febridge, which I've shown in the previous slide. And many of the images, the archival images, come from these texts. While the case of Groot Constantia was formed and spurred by a revivalist moment, which was short-lived, the declaration of Groot Constantia as a national monument arguably led to the predominance of Cape Dutch architecture as a venerated style and area of study up until the late 1990s. The pristine whitewashed walls and barn-like constructions continue to be dominant tropes in architectural education in South Africa today. In the early 20th century, these houses were written into a fictional genealogy of manor houses belonging to landed gentry. Central to this rescripting was the dual practice of narrating slavery as mild, alongside the concurrent erasure of the presence or contribution of slave labor to these homesteads. And this includes, for example, removing or redescribing what were slave lodges, slave bells. As Catherine Youssef argues in relation to geology, origins configure and prefigure the possibility of narratives of the present. The origins of architectural history in South Africa establish a material, aesthetic, and discursive space inscribed with a relationship of power. Despite being slave households, even today, very rarely are these houses considered in relation to the longer histories of slavery at the Cape. And I think this is true both for when you visit these sites, which are all monuments, and many of them are monuments and have these kind of descriptive plaques, but also in the way that these spaces are taught in universities. Fiction as history betrays a nostalgia for material, ideological, and a whitewashed colonial past. So in contrast to the more recognized architectural histories, Yvette Christianse, novelist, in the novel Unconfessed, uses fiction as a tool to read into and productively engage the loaded silence of the Cape. Unconfessed is set in the Cape Colony around 1822 and draws on over 20 years of research into 19th and 20th century court records concerning Sila, a slave captured as a child from Mozambique who was convicted of the unspeakable crime of infanticide. The novel charts Sila's life across the Cape Colony in a series of homes and as the subject of violent and serial sexual violence and abuse. In the novel, the story of slavery is not separated from the story of architecture and the wider landscape. Instead, the novel reveals an axis of power and performance where architecture, body, and land meet. So as I some of these slides show examples of where you see, for example, a typical house of a slave, but then you do see a relation in the caption, this reference to the slave quarters. So there are these hints or references, often in relation to a wider aestheticized landscape throughout these earlier architectural histories. There are also, and the more that I've been reading these texts or going back to them, the more that I realize this is the case. There are moments when the body of the slave herself emerges in stories of violence and slave revolts. In a brief passage describing the house of Waterhof, Febridge notes that, and I quote, "Waterhof is a place wherein to see visions and dream dreams. Legend says that you may hear the pattering footsteps of the mutinous slaves, wherever you care to listen for them. Later in the same passage, Fairbridge writes, "The legend which hangs about so many old Cape houses has a home at Waterhof." So Fairbridge acknowledges the same story in relation to a series of other homes in the Cape, including Welgelegen and Nooit Gedacht. For Fairbridge's readers, amidst the detailed drawings and genealogical underpinnings of the gabled homesteads and their owners, of which most of this text consists, these passages hold traces of the more violent histories of these homes. These houses are always embodied with the ghosts of the slave body and her footsteps, marking mutiny as resistance. However, by Fairbridge's own acknowledgement, these footsteps are only heard by those who care to listen for them. And I find this really interesting that this is the way that it's written. In Unconfessed, in contrast, the aesthetic of the gable is treated as a personification of the masters of the homes. This is most evident in the passages describing Sila's arrival at his second owner's farm. And Christianse writes, and Sila is the narrator, "I saw how the land had changed. There were fields. The land bent away into rows and rows of green and more green. The driver cracked the whip and the whole world cracked. There was the house, not orange but white, waiting like a queen on a wide throne, looking down through a robe of white that curled over itself like the walls through which we passed. Look, the house said, look here. I looked and could not raise my eyes." The gable in this passage is described as both beautiful and imposing and is depicted as a queen, looking down on the arrival of these new slaves. Sila, in contrast, is unable to raise her eyes. If Spivak asserts that the subaltern cannot speak, Sila cannot look. The passage is furthermore framed with the violent imagery of the whip and asks the reader to see the stuccoed walls in relation to the violence of slavery. And this association continues on the second page. "So that was how Omisi's house arrived before me. I saw nothing but the way it bent its walls and made square eyes that looked out and told the trees where to stand and pushed a long road out from itself and opened its big brown door. The creaking stopped, but the dogs ran on and barked. The whip cracked and the dogs stopped on their heels." Sila says that she saw nothing apart from the control of the house over the new arrivals and over the land. And again, the description is framed by the visual and auditory imagery of a cracking whip. Architecture's imbrication in the role of ordering and controlling both the landscape and people is further brought out in later passages, which relay the trauma of slavery as it is invested in these grand houses of the Cape. As with Toni Morrison's Beloved, this is a house saturated with spite. The house tells the trees where to stand and pushes the road out. So I'm reading fiction here as a form of subaltern representation. To return to Spivak, to claim to know or speak for the slave would amount to a paternalistic recovery of a figure whose interior world cannot be known. But in this context, Christianse's novel captures the opacity and ambiguity of slave history and evokes a sense of the violent spaces of slavery without a literal description. There is no singular manor house here, but as Fairbridge has noted of Waterhof, the legend is present in many old Cape houses. Spivak asserts that even when the subaltern does speak, we do not know how to hear her. Fairbridge's choice of words points to those who care to hear, the footsteps of mutinied slaves, suggesting too that perhaps if we care, we might hear. Christianse's novel is a response to the silence of archives, a practice of listening to those silences and looking sideways. Of the few archival records she found of Sila are the reports by the district surgeon Somerville written on December 28, 1822, which indicates bruises of a livid color on the upper eyelid of the left eye. Across the upper parts of her body, her arms, her thighs, and her legs. He stated that he found bruises of a livid color. Sila was only recognized as a person and featured in the archives due to her crime of infanticide. She was only seen by the district surgeon because of this crime. The archives describe and compare the size and direction of the bruises. So another passage reads, one is in an oblique direction upon the middle and back parts of the right arm, while another on her left shoulder measures about 4 inches by 2. While the medical record can be read as a trace of the embodied violence of slavery, the archive does not contain a full record of her life. And it does not, and even where it does talk to her, it does not do so in her voice. So as Brenna Banda has noted, the colonial encounter produced a racial regime of ownership that persists into the present. It created a conceptual apparatus in which private property remains bound to a concept of the human that is thoroughly racial in its makeup. In the process, these laws of property, associated language, ways of seeing, and modes of subjectivity render indigenized and colonized populations as outside history. Christianse writes of Sila, she's a prisoner in the country of lies. Truth was a foreign language here. So to briefly conclude, building an archive represents a moment of care. It requires a self-conscious positioning to construct categories and conceptual frames. To read an architectural history as fiction and as archive, as fiction and history simultaneously, is to understand the archive as always already compromised. The stretching of time from the violent present to the captured past enables us to draw out the sustained practices of inequality and ongoing power dynamics within architecture. It also questions whether returning to these sites and stories can enable us to escape the repetition of the violence. Caring to hear becomes a means of acknowledging historical practices of resistance and refusal. Reading the haunting traces and listening to the spectral sounds in the archives of slavery at the Cape is an intentional intervention into them and an engagement with the domination they speak to. The Cape of Good Hope, then, might not only be a place of unimaginable beauty and fertile farms, but also the Cape of Tears, Cape of Death, Cape of Struggles. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Huda. That was yeah, that was very haunting for sure. To use a word that came through a lot in the presentation. We're going to go straight over to Catalina, I think, now, and then we'll come back together. So, Catalina, can I go to you?
Yes, I'm just trying to find my window. Do you know when we share? Okay, so the work I will briefly show you today is defined by 2 tendencies, and this defines largely the work I do. The first one of these is a sensitivity to existing structures and hierarchies, to processes of everyday practices, spatial, discursive, and professional. These could be the conventions of a teaching situation or a lecture conversation, such as this one. But finding playful or performative ways to challenge these and replace them with alternative ways of doing things has been what different collaborations and projects have taught me throughout the years. And the second principle is that of starting from difference, recognizing difference between ourselves and maintaining difference as a productive tension in collaborations together and with others. Now, how to do this relate to feminist and decolonial thinking and practice? I'd like to use Patricia A. Sketcher's words in her contribution to the journal Feminist Studies from 2017, where she talks about the decolonial as that which allows for the possibilities of recuperation of, and I quote, non-self-announcing practices of bodily, spiritual, and cultural recuperation rather than an officially oppositional ideology, and I end quote. Furthermore, and here I use Catherine Walsh, who understands decolonial practices as form of resistance and acknowledges decoloniality as the ongoing, and I quote, the ongoing serpentine movement towards possibilities of other modes of being, thinking, knowing, sensing, and living. That is, and otherwise in plural. So some of my recent work has gravitated towards interrogating the other, as it's also related to the concept of the South. I will show you to do a piece that I did some years ago. It is entitled One Wound, Two Wounds, the Body as a Site of Writing. And then I will briefly introduce a more recent piece that a year later appears in dialogue with this first one. So this sketchbook is a written drawn artifact that performs unvaryingly with a side, more precisely with two sides, two lines, two traces, two threads. It monitors and documents, and it becomes the site of a site writing project which seeks to question and to transform the site of intervention. As a means of exploring textual and material possibilities, the patterning of words on the page, the design of the page itself, the edges, its boundaries, thresholds, its surfaces, the relation of one page to another, this sketchbook becomes a personal place for destabilizing an innate signified and signifier, that of a wound and pain. These point to the space where possible new meanings, healing and repairing, were constructed out from deconstructive processes of drawing, writing, cutting, and pasting. They also offer the material evidence of new critical explorations and possibilities, both autobiographical and performative. One Wound to Wound is a site writing project, and it's the result of a process that has been through different stages. It is a process of understanding London and Colombia, North and South, past and present, illness and health, namely the parts of my present and past that I have not been able to uncover. But also, and now seeing it retrospectively, it's also a process mostly of understanding being othered, of having been a racialized other. Site 1. Doris Salcedo, a Colombian artist, is part of the group of international artists selected to intervene in the Tate's Modern Turbine Hall in London. In 2007, she spoke in favor of the subtleness and soreness, opting for the construction of a negative sculpture entitled Shibboleth. As an open crack running throughout the concrete slabs of the entire floor surface, shibboleths refer to the danger at crossing borders or to being rejected in the moment of crossing borders. It is a piece about people who have been exposed to extreme experiences of racial hatred and subjected to inhuman conditions in the first world. That's her words. By introducing into the Turbine Hall another perspective, the idea is that all look down, and I quote, and maybe try to encounter the experience of these people. She writes, I wanted to make a piece that intrudes the space, that is unwelcome, like an immigrant, that just intrudes without permission, slowly, and all of a sudden is there, and it is a big presence. As a temporary exhibition, the sculpture was supposed to last for a short period of time. Afterwards, it had to disappear by being closed and sealed without leaving any trace, and leaving the space as it was for next artists to intervene. Today, the sculpture remains as a permanent inscription in the building, as a compelling scar. What was intended to disappear is now permanent. Side 2. Facing the intervened concrete slabs, my question was how to proceed. The first step, deconstruct graphically and pictorially the shibboleth's trace. The place, at sketchbook, the space, its white paper. My intention was to destabilize its innate relationship between signified and signifier, looking forward to construct out from these deconstructive processes possible new meanings. Without awareness, I hoped to isolate it from its political and cultural significance, wanted to transform its inherent signification that somehow was affecting me. As a chosen site, this triggering encounter forced me to reflect upon myself. I began rubbing, measuring, and redrawing, then cutting, pasting, and translating it into a sketchbook by trying to evidence its layers of meaning as understanding its means of construction. That was, to follow Michel Desertaux's words, my way of operating. Anatomical representations began to appear subtly in the sketchbook as an allegory of the engineering work done by Salcedo in the Tate Modern. The deconstruction of shibboleth was slowly becoming a process of the deconstruction of a scar in my chest. I confronted the picture before me and within me. what began, what began as a cultural history and artistic representations became a search for my intimate geography, my own situatedness in a foreign context and a way of operating within it. Rather than situating my body, I was trying to defamiliarize it through drawings that maimed my body. My drawings, photographs, and montages timidly constructed page after page of the sketchbook, evoking a series of associations beyond any rational interpretation and seeming to spring from a personal and coded impulse. Rather than describe the site as a given topology or geometry, they seem to recall a particular kind of perceptual encounter relating to exposure. Gradually, my project shifted from the architecture of the building to that of the human body. In enacting the body as a site of writing, it assumed and addressed the unforeseen connection between the building scar and the construction of my own experience. Sorry, I might lose my voice as we go. So I'm going to read this last sentence. In enacting the body as a site of writing, it assumed and addressed the unforeseen connection between the building scar and the construction of my own experience that relate to the experience of many having been othered. A scarring was one wound, a scar in my body, which as a trace, as an inscription, brought with it parts of my past, which I had not healed entirely. Two wounds, instead a trace in the turbine's whole floor, Doris Salcedo Shibboleth's. Shibboleth's appearance became the mirror of my personal intimate experience, a bodily sensory trace or an undigested experience of illness and being racialized as other. But as I later realized, also being other, I repeated there. The sketchbook, the place for all these intimate traces to live, to deconstruct, and more importantly, to heal and repair. This work later informed a more recent work that resists othering practices. It is an article that is entitled Nos están matando, we are being killed, which as a micronarrative stems from the urgency of exposing a worrisome situation where violence, displacement, and extraction practices are inextricably linked. Only last year, Colombia was accounted for 50% of all the murders of environmentalist leaders and human rights defenders in the world, being these mainly indigenous, peasants, and Afro-Colombian people. This micro-narrative turns to these actors who are its invisible protagonists in order to emphasize that this invisibility derives from practices of othering inherited from colonization. It therefore also informs architecture of the South, that we will speak of in a minute, as it draws on force this appearance of human bodies and bodies of water. It relates wounds and bruising of human bodies to wounding and bruising lands by extraction practices. Here, more precisely referring to hydroelectric dams. So now this is a bit of an introduction and to set the tone or like the context of how we came together and where the Architectures of the South project is at the moment. Just give me 1 second. So Architectures of the South, bruising, scarring, healing, and repairing started as a conversation after Fielding Architecture, Feminist Practices for a Decolonized Pedagogy Symposium in 2019. One of the aims of the symposium was to discuss the potential embedded in bringing together feminist practices, decolonial pedagogies, and critical thinking, but also to provide an initial field for future collaborations and kinships interested in working otherwise. Following the Fielding conference, we began a conversation on thinking across the concept of the South through spatial practice. When we met in the UK, we talked further of how the South becomes both a marker globally as a position and location imbricated with power relations, whether in talking of South London or South Johannesburg. Drawing on Ananya Roy, we understand the South as not only a physical location, but also as an embodied relationship between knowledge and power. We argue that it's therefore not enough to simply include Southern geographies in architectural history, but instead, sorry.
You need a break, Catalina.
I'm just going to be okay. But instead, we need to engage with the epistemic and methodological foundations of how we understand architectural histories of the South in the first place, as viewed through racialized, classed, and gendered bodies. We recognize that it is often involves looking beyond disciplinary boundaries and associated ways of seeing.
Okay, so in particular, our further interests draw on the concept of care and critical care through an interest in our particular contexts of Colombia and South Africa. We're both interested in thinking through the body and the land, embodied relationships to land through architecture, text, image, and photography, and different modes of creative practice, in how the inheritances of colonial practices of violence extend into the present, and the value or lack thereof ascribed to bodies deemed as racially and gendered other. Furthermore, to drawing out the entangled relationships between bruising and scarring of land, buildings, and bodies caused by displacement, violent dispossession, and extractive practices, both colonial and neo-colonial. We've both been thinking of the spatiality and presence of bruises in both land and body, and are interested in how talking across our contexts through the framework of solidarity can be both a political and ethical and critical tool for working differently. So we have three key questions that really frame, Catalina?
So these three questions have, are framing so far our project. The first one is how can we draw on the concept metaphor of the South to think specifically about architecture and its relationship to land, bodies, and violence in Southern territories? How might architecture register the intersection of entangled political geographies of dispossession and repossession that defines a global South that is, and here we quote, everywhere but also somewhere, accountable, embodied, and highly heterogeneous? And how we might begin to unsettle the coloniality of race, violence, and place by paying attention to the creative practices of resistance in architectural terms as a means to work towards repairing and healing, and without repeating the trauma of this violence.
Thank you. Great.
So this is where we are at the moment.
I mean, those questions are pretty easily answered, I think. So we should get this sorted out pretty quickly. I mean, these are great. Thank you for those two great presentations, really thought-provoking and actually both very lyrical, I thought, as well. We might just open it up for questions, for conversation, responses. I know there's a number of people here who will be interested to contribute. Samantha, could I go to you if that's okay, or maybe I don't know.
Yeah, thank you.
Conversation.
Thank you both for really interesting presentations, and it's also a warm welcome to UCD virtually. I was really interested in this connection between violence, gender-based violence, and the symmetries we might see within architecture and landscapes. And I guess I have a question about how we define gender-based violence or how we might frame it as a term. And I'm specifically, can we think about, is it possible to think about honing it as what people who work in sociology and women's studies and law in particular are doing right now? I understand, like, we've in Ireland and other places in the UK, laws have changed recently regarding gender-based violence, and they're moving away from the frame, like the term violent as an event. And I think this is interesting with architecture because it's the research is showing that actually gender-based violence isn't about this sort of cataclysmic or thunderclap event. Although you mentioned things like the slave revolt, like there are events, but actually like the real power in that word violence is with the deprivation of liberty. And it's really about the coercion over a long period of time. And that's where the fear lies, you know, that's where the power is supplanted. And I'm just wondering, like, if we if we follow like what people are doing in law now, would that change how we're also looking at architecture and landscapes? It's not something you can answer today, but I think it's worth asking, because it's, you know, architecture isn't an event either. As you said, like it has these long histories. And that's so important. That's what people are like, we do that so well in architecture. We talk about these long histories, but people in law, like it's kind of harder to get their heads around.
Huda, do you want to come in?
Thanks, Samantha. That's a really good point. I think, I'm not sure I can answer it, but I think that's exactly what a lot of feminist leaders in South Africa are writing about, what is often called a culture of rape in South Africa, and saying that we need to really move away from thinking of this as, as one-off, but rather as understanding the systemic nature.
Yeah.
And in the South African context, there's really interesting work on the histories of gender-based violence related to language, so how people speak and the kinds of things that get normalized in the way things are said, but then also slavery and this history of slavery that's not usually spoken about in South Africa. So we kind of, we have apartheid is usually the kind of cornerstone. But I think, I think it's really interesting what you're pointing out, and maybe there is something in thinking about that systemic, well, in thinking about the language of architecture, maybe is part of something that could be worked on. Like, how do we speak of this? Because, I mean, just hearing you say this, I think even the way that we teach, we almost teach through, or the typical way of teaching is through the architecture as event, but actually it's definitely not that. It's lived in and has these long and deep histories related to land also, and related to siting. But also to think about the kind of violence that is maybe systemic and structural. So I think, I think one of the things I do in part of my wider project, but I also really saw in Catalina's presentation was what it means to work across two sites, and to start to, and I think actually that's part of what we're also trying to do in this project, that is this wider conversation, that to think across spaces also helps you to realize it's not really specific what we're talking about. It is heterogeneous, there are different specificities, but there's something much wider.
And maybe if I add something, I think one of the things that we have realized, or somehow are really interested to working through, is that this, like when we think about violence, we think about particular ways of violence. So we have like a set idea of what we mean by violence, but in a way we think about the South is the same, but these concepts have to be also reshaped, remolded. So I think part of the project is to find that also that flexibility to avoid, let's say, categorizations or tools or particular ways, like more like solution-based, rather than opening up and trying to see how this can be defined or encountered, embodied in bodies, in land, in buildings, in architecture. So it's trying to try to see it as a bit more of an open concept, rather than something that tries to categorize and enclose.
I suppose I'm thinking about your final question about creative practices of resistance within architecture. I can't remember the exact phrase, but it seemed that for both of you, well, maybe literature, language itself, and then on the one hand, and then maybe architecture also, or creative practices relating to architecture, seemed to offer a path to means of resisting, or a way of operating, as you said, Catalina, that could give voice to something, articulate something, make visible, maybe. And I'm just thinking about the second half of your 4 verbs, which is about healing, recovering. I can't remember them exactly, but can it go further than pointing to, if you know what I mean, those strategies of resistance, or those languages of resistance, or can they actually begin a process of healing, renewal, telling the story, making the story different? Sorry, that I don't even know if that's a question. It's just a
no, but I guess you're you're right in what you're saying, and we do find that usually creative practices or alternative practices are very productive, and also how do I say, like this, like as alternative practices, they allow for these processes which other practices might not necessarily, because we are not like repeating the same histories, but trying to find different ways of engaging with it, and through working with those, let's say, voices that are usually not part of archives, or voices that haven't been part of wider histories. These creative practices allowed to engage with this. I think for me was really a revelation when I was doing this project, how much it did actually help in healing. So it was actually like a healing, like a mourning process, but also a healing process through a way of creating practice. And we see that, I mean, I'm working with some communities in Colombia now, indigenous communities, and in a couple of projects, and you see how this, I mean, you cannot work the same way, right? So there's going like with this plurality of worlds, or plurality of practices, these multiple practices, it's a way also of engaging with with these voices that have been silenced. Or sorry, I'm repeating myself a little bit, but I I think we do see a great potential in doing so. And if I may, I don't know if you might think the same or not, but we think is the one of the few possible ways of doing it, I guess.
Huda, do you have anything on that point?
I think, yeah, I can add a little bit. So I think there is I think you're pointing to the kind of danger in using these terms as metaphors, which is, I think we're both very aware of. And I do think that there are limitations to what we could do in a project like this. But part of, I think, thinking about not just the violence, but also questions of care or repair or healing, is to also shift the conversation from only focusing on violence to realize that I think in both of our contexts, in the kinds of things we're talking about, how do people resist and live in these places and make lives in ways that is, I think, often also silenced, or often also, so we're not just talking about a historical, we're talking about practices of resistance or ways of living otherwise that are happening and also don't find their space. And I think, part of this project is not, and definitely not wanting to repeat the violence, but find ways to think differently about these kinds of spaces or practices.
Just to follow on, I might just put a question from Miriam. Miriam, if it's okay, I'll paraphrase, or I'll just read what you've asked in the chat there. You guys can see it anyway. Where Miriam is asking about curious about why you would use such, why you use such lyrical language and potent drawings to describe such violence, terror. Is it a bridge? Is it about getting an audience to listen more attentively? Or what is there? I mean, there is a sort of tension there for sure, isn't there, between this sort of lyricism and violence. Is that something that you've thought about or considered, or is there a reason why that might be?
I mean, I think if I speak just for my drawings, I think it's I think drawings might have been different if I would have clear from the start that I was working with violence, which was not very clear in the beginning. And I think it was a bit of an irrational thinking process, irrational. So I was like working through drawing, through cutting, through pasting. I was not necessarily addressing questions of violence in the beginning. And I think when throughout the process, when I was realizing that, okay, it's part of my body, it's a question about an illness, it's a question about being othered or being considered racialized, othered. somehow, because it was, I think maybe because it was my body, I did this like with care as a way of also of healing as a part of the process. So it was, I think it was more like an irrational way of working, in which these like very subtle drawings were also communicating or trying to somehow see the, like a tenderness to it, like a softness to it, that the violence basically doesn't necessarily address. But in this tenderness, that was, I think, was part of the process of healing and repairing. It's like treating yourself kindly. So it was an act of care by these drawings. So, but they don't have the intention of these drawings is not at all so that the audience listens more attentively. I mean, this is they're transparent as they were, as they are now. I imagine if I would go back to the project now, I mean, I don't know how I will do it. Thinking if I'm thinking about violence, how these drawings will come up, that might be very different. But I see in my work that I tend to, and I think in Huda's work as well, that we tend to think about this practice of care and repair, and that's somehow through words and through images also they represent what we believe that can be done, or ways of doing things. I don't know if that's clear enough, but maybe, no, but yeah, I guess.
I think that's very clear.
Yeah.
Thank you for that comment. I think it's a really good point, and I think it's also somewhat unconscious. But I think, although what I do write about and what I do think about is so when I started this project, it actually started at a similar time to my PhD, and it's been a kind of small parallel project that has its moments. And part of my interest when I first came across this novel, Unconfessed by Yvette Christianse, was just this way of using lyrical language to talk about something that I hadn't found within architecture. And so even and there have been revisionist histories of Cape Town architecture, the difficulty of speaking about the violence or even knowing how to bring it into the conversation has always meant it's usually the byline or the footnote or the kind of the thing that is absent, that is mentioned as absent. So I think partly thinking about what language can do and thinking with people like Yvette Christianse or Toni Morrison, that part of this writing is also kind of looking for a way to write about something that is very much within the architecture, but is not I don't know if there's ways of writing within architecture as a discipline. And I think that's kind of, what I was looking for. I think there is also the very kind of context specific though. If you know anything of the Cape, it's always described as beautiful or awe-inspiring, and it really is. It's an incredible landscape. And so I think there's also something about putting together, thinking about the imageries, all the photos of the mountains on my own, and really asking, what does it mean to tell these violent stories with this beauty, and actually ask the reader to engage with them at the same time and not kind of be like, oh, because if you visit Cape Town, it's, you might go to the beautiful side and not see the ugly sides. So it's also kind of, but it is very, I think I'm still something I'm trying out, working through.
Samantha, I saw you nodding there. I don't know if you wanted to come back in on that or.
Well, that definitely, this sort of allowing these contradictions and dichotomies to have face on the page, I think is so important. And you had said something, Huda, and you talk about how there's this sense of whitewashing, but the history has allowed certain demographics and not others to project a certain innocuous, almost an attempt to project an innocuous, it's not a history, it's a fiction. But I was really struck by this word resilience. We talk about it so much in architecture now, but in such a different way. And yet, if you look at my seminar right now, for example, we're looking at monumental landscapes, and we're spending a lot of time looking at Monument Avenue in Richmond. And And there's a lot of discussion about the resilience. I mean, it's really inappropriate. I think we understand this now in architectural history to look at slaves and architectures in which and landscapes in which they've worked historically as being as being purely sites of trauma where people were victims. Because these were also some of the most resilient individuals. But that part of the history is left out of the histories that were presented now. And so like you have to have that. And usually people who suffer the most violence are the ones who also have the most resilience. But we don't talk about architecture that way.
So I guess not only the people, I think also maybe the people, maybe it's also a context specific response, but that the people that suffer more violence are the ones that engage more creatively with it as well. Mm-hmm. As a way of working through the violence, which is again something that we don't do in architecture, but is when you see the former slave colonies in Colombia and the Pacific, I mean, they have the most beautiful music, and that's a way of coping with. So it's also or like modes of resistance that are through weaving, through other ways of that escape the verbal or written word. And that they are like what we call creative, which for them might not necessarily mean the same, but I think that's again context specific. But the more violent, the more almost powerful and poetic sometimes the responses to that violence can be.
And that's really important. I think there's a certain kind of resistance in our discipline to be, objective and not to talk about the emotion within that's embodied within buildings and landscapes, but. That doesn't really work anymore, that kind of perspective.
A comment from Victoria there who's asking, it's a question really, but are people who suffer the most violence always the most resilient or just perpetually coping?
I think both. I mean, I think you have to cope, but I think, going back to like what people who work in women's studies and sociology have been writing about a lot. There's been a lot of research in this area over the past 10 years. And the word resilience doesn't just come up a lot, but there's a real meaning there.
I wonder maybe, Victoria, would you like to answer your question too? Yeah.
No, yeah, sure.
Thank you. Question. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. I guess I'm just thinking of, I think there's also something about sort of what we see as resilience. I think I'm really feeling what you had just said, Catalina. I'm thinking about, I was born and raised in the United States. I'm a Black woman. And so I'm also just thinking a lot about recent current events, including just, a couple of days ago. And I think there are ways in which it becomes really important to find these creative outlets, but I guess I'm very wary of generally the resilience discourse. Maybe I definitely haven't been reading some of what you've mentioned. But I think also there's something about the sort of continued trauma that I think is also really sort of important to recognize as well. I guess it's also, so how are we reading resilience? How are we reading coping? How are we reading these creative practices? And maybe this goes back to sort of Catalina, Huda, what you were also talking about in terms of your research.
Thank you, Victoria. No, I think, for me, I sometimes struggle with resilience, I have to be honest, because I sometimes see that it's again a framework that is used to understand, let's say, conditions or situations that we are not necessarily part of. And that, so it's almost like a way of us understanding the other, what the others are going through. And I don't know, I think there is great part of what Victoria is saying of this perpetually coping. It was think, and because the trauma is generational, trauma is inherited, it's there, it's for generations. So I don't know, my way of seeing, and maybe I might take this back later on, but I don't think necessarily it's a way of resilient. I don't necessarily think they see it as a way of being resilient, if you know what I mean. It's it's more like their everyday. So how do we cope with these situations? How do we live with these situations? How can we make something about these situations? Rather thinking like wanting to be resilient or seeing the potential in being resilient.
But you also use the term care a lot, Catalina.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So it's I see it most as practices of care. And you see it like communities, like caring after each other. That there are different ways of doing that. But sorry.
I'm thinking about. I'm conscious of time. I know people probably have places to be, so we might think about drawing to a close in the next few minutes. But just something else, just to come back to this thing of creative practice, and clearly in both instances, it seems that narrative has a role. Either narrative in the form of a sequence of entries into a notebook, or narrative in the form of a novel. And actually, funnily enough, we had a lecture last week by Ellie Mosiebi looking at talking about her housing, where she again makes really interesting use of narrative in a very different way, right? Not very different kind of territory, but I was just struck by the possibility of narrative in terms of a design, or a sort of bridge between maybe architectural history, broader histories, design. Is narrative maybe in some ways important in this? Am I barking up the wrong tree? Nope. Okay. Catalina's shaking her head.
Okay, sorry. So you're asking, is narrative?
Well, I'm sort of just thinking about narrative. I'm coming back to this thing of the creative practice as a form of resistance, or what it is, how it is one might respond. And it just struck me that narrative was able to maybe operate in a different register that somehow does capture some of those facets of architecture, including the emotional, the senses of attachment, repulsion, etc., that are possibly harder to frame, let's say, conceptually or typologically, or in terms of function. You know what I mean? That it seems to offer different modes of thinking that can give rise to different forms. That's maybe my question. I don't even know if it is a question. It's just sort of.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really, sorry, I think it's really important. And I think also, so one of the recent, it's not a recent text, it's an old text by Gayatri Spivak, which I've only come across recently, is on the Rani of Sirmur. And this is a really interesting essay for me, because one of the things she discusses is coming from literature, looking at the archive, and part of her discussion in a kind of Spivakian sense kind of explains this move and the problem of where does a post-colonial scholar look to, how does one look to fiction to speak, or literature, and yeah, I'm sort of explaining this quite clumsily, but I think the reason I'm mentioning it is I think part of the way that she then picks apart this colonial and the East India Company archive is thinking about it through fiction. So I think for me that text is really interesting, because although she sort of points to the importance of thinking about history as fiction and fiction as history, she's also kind of asking us to be wary of these different fields. So I think also in the case of so narrative is definitely something that's used, clearly by both of us, and also I think in thinking about the kinds of language to talk about these difficult histories. But I think, I guess the question is also, what does it mean for architecture, and more than what does it mean for literature? Because, and to not assume that literature doesn't have the kind of baggage that we're asking architecture to carry.
Just to add a small note to that, I think language, narrative is actually, I think is very important in both of our work, and in a way I also see it as a way of thinking about possible futures, right? Like envisioning something beyond what's there. And again, the question of care and healing and repairing comes in here. So imagining fictions is imagining fiction, for example, or narratives. It's imagining that other worlds are possible to, or how to interpret or read things that are there differently. So it gives that that flexibility, and it has an embedded potential. But yeah, I agree with Huda. The thing is how to bring it back to architecture, and that's one of our main questions, I guess.
But this is a big project, and you've got a long time. It feels like. Just maybe I'm sorry to bring things to a close, but I think in some ways this conversation is only getting started. I know that you have a session in next year's SAH, Society of Architectural Historians, which will be in Pittsburgh or somewhere online, or hopefully in Pittsburgh. But do you have other plans, or what are your next projects? What's the next thing you're going to do on this?
Shall I answer? So we have been working on this for a while, but it is something that sort of happens parallel to everything else, including COVID. Yeah, so the SAH conference, we're looking forward to that next year. And we are also organizing a series of what we're calling quiet conversations with Micah in Baltimore. And so that should, yeah, we'll share details. That should happen in the next few months. But also actually as a way of kind of expanding this conversation and opening up some of these questions further.